Most of the action potentials that cause voluntary muscle contractions originate in the brain and descend to organs located inferior to the brain via descending tracts. Previously, we learned that tracts are bundles of myelinated axons that are found in the central nervous system. These particular tracts are called descending because they contain neurons that originate in the cerebral cortex and brainstem and then travel inferiorly to the spinal cord. Eventually, these neurons synapse with lower motor neurons in the spinal cord, but these lower motor neurons are not part of the descending tract. It's the lower motor neurons that release acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction and cause a muscle contraction. In this video, we'll look at this process in a bit more detail and talk about what happens when this system malfunctions. Your objectives for this video are to describe the functions of specific motor areas in the brain and what happens when they are damaged. Also, you should be able to describe how motor signals travel through the central nervous system and stimulate muscle contraction. Finally, you should be able to explain the significance of the motor homunculus. The descending motor tracts are grouped into two categories, the pyramidal tracts and the extrapyramidal tracts. Extrapyramidal tracts control involuntary muscle contraction in the body and are responsible for things like muscle tone, balance, posture, and reflexes. The cell bodies for the neurons in these tracts are in the brainstem, and the axons for these neurons travel down the brainstem to the spinal cord, where they synapse with other neurons. The pyramidal tracts have cell bodies in the cerebral cortex, but as axons for these neurons pass through the brain and go on to the brainstem, they converge to form an inverted triangle shape, hence why these are called pyramidal. The pyramidal tracts control voluntary movements. Remember, voluntary movements are the ones that you consciously control. So when you think, I've got to go get some water, the pyramidal tracts light up with action potentials to coordinate your muscle contractions to make that happen. This is a drawing of the spinal cord. The locations where the neurons from the motor tracts terminate and synapse are shown in red. The sensory tracts, which we'll discuss in a different video, are shown in blue. Textbooks are pretty consistent in using blue for motor tracts and neurons that carry Textbooks are pretty consistent in using blue for tracts and neurons that carry sensory information, and red to represent motor tracts, motor neurons, or efferent fibers. Let's focus on the red, though, for now. The primary motor cortex is one of the principal drivers of voluntary movement in the human body. Anterior to the central sulcus, which is here, is the precentral gyrus, which is highlighted in green. Embedded within this strip of cerebral cortex are the cell bodies of the upper motor neurons that move our legs, arms, and facial muscles, among others. The axons of these neurons are myelinated, and they pass through the brain and brainstem, forming the pyramidal tracts that I've already mentioned. In this diagram, the dots represent the cell bodies for the upper motor neurons in the primary motor cortex. The line that you see here is the axon. So you can see that the axons for these neurons can be quite long as they go from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. Some of these neurons cross from one side of the body to the other as they traverse the central nervous system. This is called decussation. The majority of nerve fibers from the pyramidal tracts decussate somewhere around the medulla oblongata. So for example, you can see here, this guy is on the right side of the body. It goes through the pons on the right side of the body, but right here around the medulla oblongata, it crosses over to the left side. Let's see, what was I going to say? Right, so they continue to the opposite or contralateral side of the body. The remaining 10% of neurons don't decussate at the medulla oblongata, but rather they continue through to the anterior corticospinal tract, and they actually decussate in the spinal cord like you see here. Decussation is why the right side of the brain controls motor activity on the left side of the body, and vice versa. In anatomy, caricatures called motor homunculi are used to illustrate the motor processing for different body parts. In these drawings, body parts are mapped to the primary motor cortex to show the brain areas dedicated to movement of that body part. So here, for example, you can see that the movement of the tongue is inferolateral, but movement of the hand is superior to that. Movement of the feet is more medial as well. Interestingly, motor control of the body is inverted in the brain. Do you notice anything else strange here? Yeah, the size of the body part in the drawing is not correlated to the size of the body part in the body. Look at how big this face is compared to this torso. Is your face bigger than your torso? I don't think so. The size of the body part in the drawing tells you something about the proportion of neurons dedicated to the movement of that body part. So we can see the tongue, the face, and the hands are really large in this image. That means that proportionally there are more neurons dedicated to their movement than to the foot or to the torso. Well, why is that? Well, think about the small motor units that were needed to control fine and precise movements that are central to those body parts. Now, don't fall into the trap of thinking that all of the neurons that control specific muscles are in the one area indicated by the homunculus. Electrophysiology readings have shown that neurons controlling body movement are actually located throughout the primary motor cortex. Similarly, stimulation of specific areas of the primary motor cortex results in movements that involve many muscles. Oh, one more thing. Because of decussation, these diagrams actually show movement on the opposite side of the body. So this diagram of the left primary motor cortex is showing processing that will move the right side of the body. In addition to the primary motor cortex, movement of the body requires input from many motor association areas. Association areas integrate sensory information and combine that with motor function to determine the appropriate response based upon stimuli in our environment. Your motor association areas are unimodal. They're involved in planning, guidance, coordination, and execution of movement. The premotor cortex is the first of our motor association cortices. This area is just anterior to the primary motor cortex. So it's right here. And is represented by this kind of difficult to see red color. I'll outline it for you to kind of help you see it. Maybe I shouldn't do it in red though. Let's choose a different color. Here we go. Yellow. Like the primary motor cortex, this area of the brain contains upper motor neurons that are in charge of controlling voluntary movement in the body. For many years, neuroscientists thought the main function of the premotor cortex was to plan motor activities that would then be carried out by the primary motor cortex. What kind of movements? Learned or skilled, or repetitious movements. In the last 10 years or so, this idea has been undergoing a revision, and the function of the premotor cortex is again under discussion. Because I want you to be as knowledgeable as possible, I'm going to tell you about the changes to this idea, but you must understand that these ideas are still under discussion and they're new. The current view of the premotor cortex is that it's composed of a number of small areas that encode or control a number of distinct behaviors. The medial portion of this cortex appears to play a role in directing motor movements related to our expression of emotional behavior. There's also some indication, there's also some indication that neurons there are involved in coordinating two-handed activities. No doubt that means some of the neurons in this area communicate with each other or across the corpus callosum. More laterally, like around in here, the neurons appear to be primarily involved in motor activities related to communication, both in terms of speech and in writing. Also in this area are mirror motor neurons. Now this is an area that's currently under study as these neurons were only discovered in the last 20 years. But there are neurons that fire action potentials when an individual observes a movement in someone else or something else. It's thought that these neurons encode the intention of movement in another individual and provide the foundation for understanding or for inferring intention by observing their actions. And these neurons may also be involved in imitative learning. So for example, if somebody acts like they're going to hit you, this area of the brain lights up and kind of tries to guess whether that movement is an accident, whether that person's having a medical emergency, or are they really trying to threaten you. The truth is, this area probably contains a mosaic of areas that encode a number of behaviors. So again, it's a developing idea, but neuroscientists think that the premotor cortex probably has lots of small areas that encode different behaviors, directs movement in relation to emotion, coordinates two-handed activities, and another thing is that it's thought that this area helps to interpret intent behind movements, like social clues, could also be involved in imitative learning or understanding. Broca's area is a major speech area located in the premotor cortex on the inferior aspect of the premotor cortex. In other words, it's right here. Notice that this area is just superior to the temporal lobe. When we looked at brain lateralization a couple of lectures ago, I noted that some brain functions are located in one hemisphere. This is one of them. Broca's area is typically located in the dominant hemisphere, so the one that corresponds with movement of your dominant hand. So for people who are right-handed, this area is going to be in the left hemisphere. Remember, decussation, contralateral control? Right. So right-handed people, it's going to be in the left hemisphere, and for people who are left-handed, it may be in the right hemisphere. What does Broca's area do? It's a motor speech area that directs the muscles of speech production. It also seems to play a role in planning speech. When people develop a lesion or they have damage to Broca's area as a result of a stroke or maybe an infection, they can develop a disorder called Broca's aphasia. In Broca's aphasia, language comprehension is intact, but speech is not. So aphasia is a language disorder, and it can affect all modalities of communication, including writing, reading, speaking, and listening. And aphasia tends to happen when there's some sort of brain damage caused by any number of injuries like a stroke, a tumor, brain infection, dementia, or maybe a traumatic brain injury. In Broca's aphasia, Broca's area becomes damaged and people can understand speech, but they can't produce it well. They may omit words while trying to answer a question or say frequently while trying to find the right words to communicate. If you're interested in learning more about Broca's aphasia and how it presents in patients, I will post a link to an example in the upper right corner of this slide. Wernicke's area is a separate speech area that deals with language comprehension, that is, the ability to understand what someone else is saying. This area is located within the parietal and temporal lobes over here. It's represented by the orange mass. Like Broca's area, Wernicke's area is part of a multimodal association cortex, but again, here the sensory functions are especially important. Just as damage to Broca's area can impair communication, damage here also impairs communication, which is observed as impaired comprehension, but the motor function doesn't seem to be affected. So asking a question of someone with Wernicke's aphasia results in free-flowing but nonsensical answers. The affected person's speech will not be punctuated with ums and ahs like the person with Broca's aphasia, but it won't make sense. What they're saying just won't make sense. If you're interested in knowing more about Wernicke's aphasia, I'm going to post a video for you on the upper right hand of this slide. Click that and take a look at how this particular disorder presents. The last motor region that we'll talk about here is the frontal eye field. This area is located at the anterior border of the prefrontal cortex, and it gives voluntary eye movement. It's responsible for voluntary eye movement and the control of visual attention. Specifically, this area helps our eyes move simultaneously and look in the same direction, particularly when the movements are fast ones. And it helps us gaze from left to right. So if you think about it, when you look out into your yard or to the beach, you may hold a steady gaze for a few seconds, but you probably spend a fair amount of time scanning the scene, looking for interesting things to view. Your eyes jerk around when you do this in a movement called a saccade. Injuries in this area uncouple the eyes so that one eye will gaze laterally towards the side of the brain where the damage is located, but it can't look towards the opposite side. So if the damage is on the left side of the brain, then the left eye will kind of gaze to the left and it can't look to the right. Because a different part of our brain is responsible for our ability to track moving objects, this ability is not usually affected by damage to the frontal eye field. It's typically just the gaze. If you're interested in knowing more about this, I'll post a link to the upper right side of your screen. So in summary, we've been talking about how motor signals travel through the central nervous system and stimulate muscle control. Remember, there are two types of neurons involved here. You have the upper motor neurons, which go from the cerebral cortex to different parts of the brain and maybe to the spinal cord. Then you have the lower motor neurons, which connect the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles. Remember, the fibers that are bringing that information are called efferent fibers. We talked about the significance of the motor homunculus. Remember, this is that part or that map of the brain that tells us proportionally how many neurons are dedicated to moving specific parts of the body. We also talked about the functions of different motor areas. So you will definitely want to know what Wernicke's area, Broca's area, and the frontal eye field do. And you'll want to know what happens when they're damaged. Those could be questions that you get on your next exam. So that's it for this video. I hope that everything made sense. If you have any questions about this video or any of my other videos, please don't hesitate to send me an email, a text, or drop by office hours so that we can talk about any concerns, confusions, or questions you might have. So I'm going to log off now, but I wish you good luck, good studying, and I'll see you at the next video.